learned today that the star witness in one of Manafort's trials is still cooperating with the special counsel's investigation. Former Trump campaign aide Rick Gates has been working with Mueller's team for more than a year, and today lawyers told the court Gates is not ready to be sentenced because he is still cooperating with several ongoing investigations, plural. But while Mueller was able to flip Gates, he never did manage to fully flip Gates' former boss, Paul Manafort. So is Mueller really about to be done with his investigation without fully flipping Manafort, and oh, by the way, without ever getting a presidential interview in front of the grand jury? Joining me now are Mimi Rocah, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York and an MSNBC legal analyst, and Glenn Kirshner, a former federal prosecutor and also an MSNBC legal analyst. Mimi, let me start with you. The significance of the Gates delay in sentencing again. We're sitting here on one hand today. It is Ides of March Day, so the Mueller report coming out today would have had a lot of extra symbolic meaning to some writers. But here we were anticipating potentially a Mueller report filing, and instead we get a delay. Are we over-anticipating the Mueller report finding? Could we really be weeks away?
We could, Chuck. I mean, I certainly don't claim to know the answer of when we're getting the report. But I will say this. I don't think that these things are necessarily inconsistent. In other words, I'm increasingly thinking that Mueller's special counsel office is not going to exist in, the near future. I'm not going to put a time on it. But
Gotcha.
that office, I mean, we've seen Andrew Weissman is leaving. One of the central FBI agents is leaving. I think we're going to hear about other prosecutors leaving. I don't think Mueller and his team, frankly, want to or can sustain what they've been doing. These people left their family for 2 years. They're, working 80 to 100-hour weeks around the clock. And I think Bob Mueller is a creature of the Department of Justice and wants to hand as much of this off to the Department of Justice, which is not a bad thing. The Department of Justice offices all around the country, and Main Justice itself is more than capable of handling much of this, whatever this is exactly. And so I think that we may see a report from Bob Mueller, but that doesn't mean that the investigations and certainly not the prosecutions are over. I mean, we know Roger Stone is going to trial in November.
Right.
That may, is going to be other prosecutors, and that's just one example.
Yeah, we have 4 open cases actually right now. Roger Stone, we have a trial. Michael Flynn is ready for sentencing. Gates still cooperating. Michael Cohen, of course, reporting to prison. Glenn, one of the ways I was looking at the Mueller, the Manafort sentencing this week is that it was, while, yes, he's being put behind bars, it was a reminder that Mueller really never got him to flip. We can debate. I mean, he's being sentenced for lying to the grand jury. He didn't really cooperate. Is this a failure for Mueller? Does this mean it's an incomplete report?
I think it's a mixed bag. I agree with you, Chuck. He didn't get him to fully flip because we heard Judge Jackson say that Manafort continued to lie. He lied to the investigators and he lied to the grand jury. So my suspicion is that Manafort told Mueller as much as Manafort was willing to tell Mueller while still being concerned about perhaps threats from the Russians if he told Mueller everything. Yeah. We have seen what the Russians have done to people who crossed them in London and elsewhere. So that doesn't surprise me. I do think that the Gates information about how Gates continues to assist in multiple investigations is really important because, listen, Gates and Manafort were co-conspirators together, no doubt about it. What we find, and I'm sure Mimi can tell you the same thing, when we investigate conspiracies and we get a cooperator from the inside, it's remarkable how one cooperator knows everything that has gone on.
So you think Mueller may have everything he needs from Gates?
I think so, because
that he would have gotten from Manafort anyway.
Even if Gates didn't commit every crime with Manafort, I can tell you Manafort would have told him, so Gates could be on point as to who's the enemy, who's the ally, who do we owe money, who owes us money.
Mimi, the president today tweeted there should not have been a Mueller report, that there's no Mueller report there. He's creating this mythology that somehow the special counsel happened because of the Steele dossier, which is, I think, a new one in the different ways that he's concocted this. I go back and forth here. On one hand, I feel like the president wants to say he's vindicated. On the other hand, he still seems to fear this Mueller report.
Right. I mean, exactly. The fact that the House yesterday voted to essentially say, let's see the Mueller report. And the president is still saying, no, there shouldn't even have been one in the first place, means he has something to fear. Because this goes back to this very basic concept that almost has gotten lost because there's been so much noise since the beginning of this. But since day one, Trump has opposed this investigation and tried to smear it and obstruct it. And if you're innocent, if you have nothing to hide, you want the facts to come out. The facts are your friend. And that is clearly not the way Trump views this. And so, again, it seems to be because a rational person would conclude that that's because the facts are bad for him. And I think that's increasingly been true. Whenever facts do come out, they are not good for Donald Trump.
I was asking a senator the other day, do you plan to subpoena Manafort? Do you plan to bring him before Congress? And somebody reminded me, a lawyer said, he's got this open case now in Manhattan, the Manhattan DA, Glenn, and he would need to be immunized if, his lawyer would probably ask to be immunized. But there may be a double jeopardy question here. I've had some lawyers say that Manafort may have a legitimate double jeopardy case against the Manhattan DA because he's being sentenced for essentially tax fraud. They're hitting him for mortgage fraud, which is connected to the tax fraud. Strong case for Manafort?
So, I have heard the opinions about the double jeopardy issue that might present itself as a result of the New York charges. I would hope, as a former career prosecutor, that Cyrus Vance has really done his homework and decided to bring only those charges that won't be defeated by the New York double jeopardy law.
Which is pretty tough. It's even tougher than the federal law.
It's pretty defendant-friendly. It really
very
is.
Defendant-friendly.
It is. But it looks like some of the charges that have been brought by the New York authorities may have a real uphill battle on the double jeopardy challenge, but others may not. So listen, they can always dismiss some of the charges, which doesn't make them look good, but I think they can move forward on others.
Mimi, you were an AUSA in the Southern District of New York, so you're familiar with the double jeopardy law in New York State. What's your take on that?
Right. It's much more restrictive than what the Constitution requires. So I think a lot of people assume, well, as long as there are different charges, different elements to be proven in each charge, it's okay, because that's really kind of basically what the Constitution requires. But in New York, if there is overlap in the facts, then you have a problem. I think two things. One, Cy Vance must have thought this through. I think he is being aggressive in the charge, but some of the charges are safe because they are based on hung counts. So he probably figures, you know what, I lose some counts, I've got some other counts.
But hang on, he ended up pleading guilty to the hung counts. Manafort.
Well, then, yes, then that would be a problem if he pled guilty. That's true. I forgot about that. But he's doing this as an insurance policy. So if Trump comes in and pardons Manafort, there's an indictment there that then you at least have a legal battle over, right? First of all, whether it could be charged, and then second of all, whether a pardon does away with the double jeopardy issue. And if it does away with the double jeopardy issue because of the pardon, that's a legal question, too, that's very open. So I think he's being aggressive here, but this is a case where you want a prosecutor to be aggressive if what you're guarding against is possibly the corrupt use of the pardon power.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.